I'm convinced that right now is this perfect time for some people to make a comeback. We've been talking about this. You saw it on the video. We are talking about what it looks like after a setback to experience a comeback. And I've just become convinced that, there's just like these times, especially even over the last couple of years. Anytime, I don't know if you guys feel this way, anytime you start building momentum, all of a sudden another wave comes. And the peaks are higher, the spikes are higher than they were before, and it's like all of a sudden the momentum just gets washed right out from under you. I don't know if that's how you felt over the last few years. I think there are some people who do, because I believe that there's very specifically something that the Holy Spirit would speak to people who get that and feel that today. Liz was watching the news last week, I think it was, where I had mentioned several weeks back that 90% of national news, clear studies indicate 90% of national news is negative, because you can always find a negative story to tell somewhere in the United States. In Springfield, if you're just telling local stories, you're going to find a 50-50 split. But if you're telling the story and you're looking for negative stories, because that's what people latch on to, you can find one in Idaho one day and Florida the next. Like, there's always going to be negative stories. And she was watching national news, and she said it wasn't even 90%, like 29 minutes of a 30-minute broadcast, national news. The first 29 minutes was all negative story, gloom and doom, every single one. And then all of a sudden, right at the end, there was like, well, there may be a glimmer of hope for like 30 seconds. And then they ended the broadcast. It was like, what? Like, at some point, like, as you're hearing all of this negativity over and over and over again, it is easy to be paralyzed. And I believe, even in preparation for today, that there are some people who have been paralyzed over the last several years that God is calling awake and calling out. And He is saying, it's time to step up, it's time to step out, it's time to take that next step in your comeback. And so a couple of weeks back, last week, I would say, it was about David. And it was really interesting because I was talking about the fact that this was the time when kings would go to war, and David did not go out to war. He stayed at home and he sent out. And there were some people who reached out to me and said, man, that's exactly how I've felt. I felt like that idea that there was something I was supposed to be doing, but I've been hiding away. And I know that experience because even in the last several years, there's been times where, man, like, isolation begets isolation, right? You get isolated. I get isolated. When I get isolated, and believe me, we in our small group, we were talking about introverted versus extroverted, and everybody in the group said, oh yeah, we're all introverts. Like, right down the row. And you look at us and you're like, I do not think that means what you think it means. Like, we're all sitting there in this group and we're like, but we all love getting away and recharging and being away from the group of people. And I do see myself as an introvert. Like, that's just, for me, I don't recharge in front of people. I recharge, man, when it's quiet and I'm alone, and with Jesus Christ especially, like, that's it for me. But like, even as I say that, like, as I get alone, and that moves from alone time to isolation time, that isolation, the more I get isolated, the more I crave isolation, and it just builds on itself. And I just believe, especially for people who know exactly what I'm talking about there, that God is calling you out from that, and that He is calling you to make a comeback, and that this is the time. Because I know there is another spike, right? Like, it's another wave of the thing, and you're like, man, when does this ever end? And every wave and every peak and every spike seems to be bigger than the last one. You're just like, oh man, is it ever going to be over? And I think that for some of us, that can create like just this overwhelming sense that like this thing is never going away. And I don't believe that's the case at all. That's why I am the type of pastor that I am. I will never be a gloom and doom pastor. Because when I read the story of Moses, I see that often the setback is not a setback, it's a setup. And often when it seems like things are falling apart, that they're not falling apart, they're falling into place. And that ultimately, that we love and serve a God who does not need us, right? He is the God who is beyond need for us. He is the self-reliant one, and yet He is with us, and He is for us, and He is for our good forever. So I will never be gloom and doom, because a lot of times when I look around and I go, man, gloom, doom. There's plenty of opportunity for me to focus on those things, but ultimately recognizing that God is on the throne and He is working in our world, it's like, wait, all I have to do is walk along with Him and participate in that. And so when I look around, I see God at work. I see God doing something, and we get to participate in it. And so I'm not filled with gloom, and I'm not filled with doom. I'm excited for what God is doing. And so we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. But then sometimes it's not like, hey, oh, wow, God is doing something behind the scenes, and it's all what he's doing. Sometimes it's our own fault. And that's what we talked about last week with David. Sometimes we experience setbacks because of the fact that we did dumb things, right? We know better, and we do it anyways. It has consequences. And so we talked about when it's all your fault. But today, what I want to talk about is when it's far too late. When it's far too late. When the process has gone too long and it's no longer possible for it to be turned around. Last year I was invited to speak at a conference in Germany, which is awesome, because I don't know how many times you get invited to speak at a conference in Germany. For me, it happens all the time. And But in spite of the fact that it happened all the time, I was very, very honored by it, a little surprised, and of course said, yes, I'll pray about that. Yes. I mean, it was, okay, real quick prayer, happened subconsciously, but talked to Liz, we were like, hey, let's go for it. And as part of that process, went and checked our passports. And we had a feeling that they were, but they were expired, right? Because we don't go out of the country that often. They last 10 years or something like that. And so ours had expired a couple of years back. And so we look at the passport, we're like, And this was in May, and we were supposed to be speaking in October. So in May, actually I was invited in April, beginning of May, I'm like, okay, I got to renew the passports. Go out to the State Department's website, take a look at it. It says 4 to 6 weeks or whatever it was. 4 to 6 weeks was what it said on the website. I'm like, no problem. Don't even need to expedite this. I don't need this in 2 weeks because I've got until October, right? So go through the whole process, do new pictures, make sure you get everything right, because if you even get the slightest thing wrong, if you give them an opportunity to deny you, they will take that opportunity to deny you. So I checked every box, made sure that I went through it 3 times before I turned it in, had some professionals look at it. Okay, did I get everything right here just to renew these passports? 4 to 6 weeks. I'm like, okay, we're good. Send it all off. 4 weeks goes by. At about the 4-week mark, I'm like, okay, it's been 4 weeks, and I start checking the mail. Every single day. I'm like, okay, maybe today's the day, right? My hope builds as I walk. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about because you did this with decoder rings, right? Well, I did this with a passport, a little bit more important than that decoder ring. I don't even think. Anyways, so I'm walking out to the mailbox every single day, and every single day the hope builds a little bit. I walk up to the mailbox, open it up, and it's not there. Every single day for 2 weeks that happened. I'm like, okay, it's 6 weeks. We're within that time frame, right? It's supposed to be 4 to 6 weeks. And so 6 weeks comes, and I'm getting a little nervous here, but I know that I've still got several months. It's okay. But still, every day, hope builds, hope devastated. When I walk out there and there's nothing from the State Department saying, hey, here's your passport. 6 weeks. Continues on, 8 weeks. Now, at this point, I'm 2 months out, right? So this is May into June, June into July. Okay, so I've still got probably about a month and a half, but they had to get my passport in order to buy the tickets with enough time to make sure everything was working. Plus, they had to get it to the military base that I was going to be speaking on, and so they had to have my passport ahead of time in order to approve me and all of those sorts of things. And so they had a deadline, and I'm sitting here getting closer and closer to that deadline. I start getting nervous. End of July, I look at their website again, and they had changed 4 to 6 weeks to 12 to 18 weeks. They said, I'm sorry, it turns out that everybody's getting ready to travel post-COVID, right? Because COVID's over. And so we're getting this overwhelming applications for passports. And so it's slowing down the process. And, we're the federal government, super efficient. And so I'm 12 to 18 weeks. I'm like, oh man, that's close. But at this point, it's been several months. And I think, man, as long as I get it by August, I'm okay. So I didn't expedite even still, because I think, man, as soon as I expedite, it starts the whole process over again. So that's all right. So we get into August. In August, Afghanistan falls. The entire State Department shifts and totally just ignores passports for a month and a half, right? just start focusing on, and for good reason, right? Like there's plenty of other things that they need to be focused on. Like I call them, I'm on hold for 90 minutes before they hang up on me. And I feel like that's good, like I'm making progress, right? And so they hang up on me. I'm like, okay, never mind, call them again, do the whole thing again, hang up on me again, call them again. This time they answer. They talk to me for 30 seconds and then hang up on me. I was like, this is killer, right? But then it gets into August, into September. At this point, like, it's game over. Like I'm running out of time. And yet every single day I'm like hoping maybe today the passport shows up. I go out to the mailbox time and time again. Eventually I had to call those who had invited, and I said, I'm so sorry, I can't make it. My passport just hasn't made it in. We're past the 18-week mark and it's just too late. I can't make it, right? The next day Germany shuts down their borders and they had to cancel the entire trip anyways, which, for me, I guess is positive, but I'm sitting there looking at it and going, oh, that's a bummer. 4 days go by, walk out to my mailbox. Open it up, there's my passports. And thankfully, I had paid to expedite it right about week 18. Thought just in time, right? But every single day when you experience the hope build and then the hope dashed, man, at some point you just give up. You're just like, it's not going to happen. And some of us feel that way just in general. When every time, like, you think you're moving past this, and then another wave comes along, and you're just right back where you started. And you, at some point, just start to think, this is the way it's going to be forever. This is it. This is the rest of our lives. This is just the way it goes. It's far too late. So I think we should read a story. How about the story of Lazarus? When it's far too late. When it's far too late. And I'll just tell you, John 11, if you want to flip there, while you're turning there, most important point of today is this. It's not over until God says it's over. And then when God says it's done, it's done. It's not over until God says it's over. But when God says it's done, it's done. John chapter 11. I've preached on this passage one time before. In my ministry. One time I preached on this. It's a long story. Technically, I guess it was 2 sermons because I split it into 2. Took the half one week and then the second half the next. That was March of 2020. These were the last sermons before the shutdown. And as I was reading those sermons in preparation for today, the gist of them was, come what may in 2020, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. And that was tested, right? But for some of us, man, I just believe that for you, these sermons, this passage, this story, will be the sandwich for the beginning and the end, right? Setback and comeback, because it's time. So I just want to challenge you with that. It's not over until God says it's over. And when he says it's done, it's done. We're going to read the whole thing today. It is 44 verses, so it's going to take about 5 minutes to read. And I'm going to read every bit of it. And I'm going to do my best. I'm not going to stop even once as I'm reading it, and I'll just say some things afterwards, okay? So otherwise, we'll be here for 2.5 hours. John chapter 11, and I'm not going to be able to tell you all that there is here, because, man, this is such a great, great passage, right? Like, there's so many things we could focus on here, but I'm just going to focus on a few. John chapter 11, verse 1. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the 2 sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. But when Jesus heard about it, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So, although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. But his disciples objected. Rabbi, they said, only a few days ago, the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again? And Jesus replied, there are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there is danger of stumbling because they have no light. Then he said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up." And the disciples said, "Lord, if he is sleeping, he will soon get better." They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there. For now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him." Thomas, nicknamed the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let's go too and die with Jesus." When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." "Yes," Martha said, "he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. And everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I've always believed that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God." Then she returned to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, "The teacher is here and wants to see you." So Mary immediately went out to him. Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep. So they followed her there. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. "Where have you put him?" he asked them. And they told him, "Lord, come and see." Then Jesus wept. And the people who were standing nearby said, "See how much he loved him." But some said, "This man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. "Roll the stone aside," Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, "Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible." And Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" So they rolled the stone aside. And then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so that they will believe that you have sent me." And then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." Jesus loved this family. It says 3 times through this passage, Jesus loved this family. Right at the beginning, they say, "Jesus, the man you love, is sick." And then, after it says that, it says, "Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus." Then later in the story, Jesus weeps, and everybody standing around looking on says, "Wow, look how much he loved Lazarus." And I think that's interesting because of the fact that John, who wrote this book, of course, calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. Right? It's like everybody who interacts with Jesus, that was the calling card that he leaves with them, right? Like that they knew that he loved them. And when John writes this book, he tells us very clearly what it's all about. And in fact, you can see in the book, all through the book, a series of signs, because really what John tells us is that the whole point is that we would believe he is who he said he was. And so he leaves us with these signs that reveal to us his character and what he's about. There are 7 of them throughout. And this 7th one is the final one, kind of showing, not kind of, absolutely showing Jesus' power and the fact that he is God. It shows us his power. It shows us his godness. And this final one is the pinnacle of all of the signs. After this, you cannot read this story without coming to one of 2 conclusions. Number 1, the Bible isn't perfect, and that maybe it's just a bunch of stories that aren't true. It's one conclusion you can come to. The only other conclusion you can come to is that Jesus is God. It's either one or the other. You can't walk a middle way after reading this story. Like, it brings you to the point of having to make a choice here. You have to have a response. Either you believe that he is God or you believe it's all a load. Like, there's no, okay, fine. There's no middle path. It's one choice or the other. There's no middle way. And I think that's important for us to see, because a big part of what I believe God is calling us to as a church this year, as I look at what are we stepping into and what's next for us, and this is it. How do we live our lives in such a way that it brings people that we interact to that same juncture? Either this person is crazy or Jesus is God. That's it. We need our lives to bring people to that same point, that we live in such a way, because that's what Lazarus' life does. And if you look at immediately afterwards, it says, for those who were there, some of them believed that Jesus was who he said he was, and some of them didn't. And then they tried to kill Lazarus as a result of this, because he was evidence that brought people to a certain point, to a certain decision. Lazarus' life forced people to make a decision. Is Jesus who he said he was? Or, man, is this just all a load? And man, may that be the case for us. That our lives bring people to that same point. I'm not saying we smack people upside the head with a Bible. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that we live in such a way that it does not make sense unless Jesus is God or we're crazy. Right? And the way we talk and the way that we love and the way that we minister and the things that we do, it doesn't make sense unless Jesus is God and he has done something such in us that either we're crazy or he is who he said he was, and boy, that person's living again, right? Like, that's the only possibilities, and may that be the case. And that's really what this story is about. And yet, in spite of that, like 3 times through this story, his love is what saturates it. It's weaved throughout it, right? Like you cannot read this story without hearing about Jesus' love. And to be clear, his disciples are not the most lovable people, right? Even when you read verse 12, the disciples, he tells them, gives them a very clear kind of analogy. Lazarus is sleeping. It's a euphemism for he's died. And his disciples say, well, if he's dead, we should let him sleep, because then you'll get better. Let him rest, Jesus. And like, you look at that and you're like, man, these guys are so dumb, right? Like, but, and you think, okay, well, maybe it's just like the one disciple who's there for comedic relief. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's the one that all the other disciples, every time that guy talks, that they're all looking at him going, dumb Andrew. I mean, come on, Andrew, Andy. Come on now. Let's grow up a little bit. No, but it's not the comedic relief disciple. What does it say? It says the disciple said. So Andrew's like, now wait, Jesus. If he's sleeping, he'll get better. And all the other disciples are like, oh, good one, Andrew, man, you nailed it. Like, that was spot on. That's exactly what I would have said. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is all the disciples. And man, that should be an encouragement to us. Because these guys are not the most brilliant guys. And yet these guys turned the world upside down. Why? Because the power of the Holy Spirit, and because they believed that Jesus was who Jesus said he was. And so they turned the world upside down. Man, may that be an encouragement to us, because a lot of times I think we are exactly like the disciples here, where we're like, now, Jesus, I really want to point out this thing to you. Like, and he's like, you think I don't know, right? We are them. And sometimes we do stupid things like the disciples did. And in the same way, by the power of the Holy Spirit, if we believe he is who he said he was, the world can be turned upside down again. I'm just convinced of that. And his love for them is evident all through it, in spite of the fact that they may not have been the most lovable people. But his love, it says, causes him to do some things that are incredibly confusing to them and is even confusing to us. That verse, which says, he loved them, so he stayed 2 days longer, in the New Living Translation, which is all about making it understandable, right? Like, the words they choose are all about making sense of things that often are a little bit more difficult to understand if it was in the original language or if it was following the perfect structure of the original language. New Living Translation says, so although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. But that's not what it says in the original language. The reason why the New Living Translation tries to make sense of it is it doesn't make sense. Because in the original language it says, he loved them, so he stayed where he was 2 more days. It's not, although he loved them, he stayed. No, it is because of his love for them that then he stayed where he was and made them wait 2 additional days. See, our love for someone would cause us to respond immediately, right? If Liz calls me and I'm in a meeting, there's a good chance I'll answer. If she doesn't leave a message and immediately calls me a second time, I know this is an emergency and I answer regardless. Like if that happened right now, it doesn't matter that I'm preaching. It doesn't matter in front of a bunch of people. If she calls me twice, I'll check my zipper. Okay, good. But then I'm going to answer. Why? Because of the fact that I love her and I know if there's an issue, I need to respond to it, right? And for us, time affects our ability to respond to it, right? And if we allow time to go by, my options, my opportunities to affect and impact the situation decrease. That's just the way it goes. 10 years ago now, it's been a while, but 10 years ago, it's only happened once, it only needs to happen once, and you never do it again. 10 years ago, right before the first frost, I did not take the hose off of the spigot outside. Sounds like some other people in here have done the same thing. Don't you be looking at me like I did something like nobody else has done. I didn't do it. I didn't take it off. And just like everybody else who's had that exact same situation, what happened was the water in the hose froze, which backed up the water into the pipe, and eventually it just expands to the point where it busts the pipe. All through winter, everything was fine. No problems. I was smiling, she was smiling, we were all happy. And then spring comes, and I decided to power wash some stuff outside there. So I get out there, put the hose in, turn the water on. I'm power washing for like 45 minutes. And Liz comes outside yelling, Ellen, Ellen! And I'm like, it's probably not a big deal. No, immediately, I'm like, something's going on. I stop everything, and she goes, there is water everywhere downstairs. The pipe had busted, water's all over the storage room, into the carpet, and because it had gone for like 45 minutes, without me noticing, there was water everywhere. It took us days, and thankfully at the time I was a youth pastor, so I just called a bunch of students and I said, hey guys, why don't we do a party at our house? Pizza, and if you have any wet dry vacs, bring those too, okay? And so we're working for like days cleaning this whole mess up, and we got it all fixed and we got through it. But like as time passes, your options for repairing it decrease. The options decrease as time increases. Our ability to impact a situation is inversely correlated to the amount of time that passes. So as a result, the quicker we respond to those we love, right? So because of the fact that we know if time passes, we might have less options, we immediately respond. Now for Jesus, that's not the same. And so we have to be really, really careful about drawing up equations where we interpret his love by our circumstances. We can't draw an equation up where our quick response showing our love means that the speed of his response speaks to his love for us, because it's not the same. Instead, we need to interpret our circumstances by his love for us. So if you've been waiting a while for the thing to turn around, for the comeback to happen. And it hasn't happened yet. Don't get discouraged or doubt his love. His ways are not our ways. In fact, Jesus says, listen to it, Lazarus is dead and I am glad. That's the literal translation there. It says, Jesus is dead and I am glad, ... Okay, it doesn't say Jesus is dead and for your sakes. No, that's our trying to make it smooth. In the literal, it says Lazarus is dead and I am glad. Okay, Lazarus is dead and I am glad. And then it says, and for your sakes I am glad, because now you will have an opportunity to believe. The disciples and Mary and Martha and Lazarus and their belief in who he is and what he has come to do is more important than anything else. His love motivates him to this deeper, more valuable end. And so he arrives and he cries and he goes to the tomb and he sees the stone in front of the doorway and he says, roll that stone aside. And Martha says, there will be an odor. And this is the only place in the Bible where I am KJV only. Because Martha actually says, he stinketh. It's so much better in the King James Version. And I think any other version there is inappropriate. He stinketh. And I love it. Jesus said, if you believe, you will see the glory of God roll away the stone. And man, that stone, I think, symbolizes a lot. I'm not the type, when I read a story in the Bible and I say, well, the horse here represents this, and this represents this. But there is no doubt that this stone represents unbelief for them, and very clearly so, right? Because as they were waiting, at some point they put him in the tomb, and the stone rolls across, and it is done. And as long as that stone sits there, it's safe. Belief in Jesus as the resurrection and the life won't be challenged. It stays there for the last kind of final moments, right? But the moment it's rolled aside, either the belief will be validated or it will not. And Jesus doesn't lessen that. In fact, as you read this story, what is it really about? As much as it mentions love, what else does it mention? Belief. He says it to the disciples. You will believe. And he says, I'm glad so that you will believe. And then, in fact, if you hear his prayer in verse 41, verse 40, Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? Verse 41, so they rolled the stone aside, and then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here so that they will believe that you sent me. I mean, this is about belief and understanding and believing that he is who he said he was. And so he says, I'm even in my prayer, as I'm talking to the Father, I'm going to pray out loud so that everybody has an opportunity to hear what I'm saying so that they will also believe. Lazarus is dead, and I am glad so that you might believe. That stone over the tomb represents unbelief. Roll it away. Well, but Lord, believe, he says. Just believe. And I wonder, for us, for some of us in particular, what stone of unbelief has been rolled in front of that thing that we waited and waited and waited and waited for? And eventually you just say, I'm done. You roll, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to be exposed to the odor of it as you're waiting for it, and you move on. And Jesus says, roll that stone away. What has been too long? What has too much time gone by for? What dream is dead? What never became a reality? Because time seems to be the enemy of belief here. As time passes, belief decreases. And I think often that's our situation as well. Time passes and passes and passes, and nothing happens. At some point, I gave up on the federal government, right? State Department's not going to send me a passport. It's just not going to happen. Expedite it, doesn't make a difference. Call them, doesn't make a difference. At some point over time, you just plain stop believing because belief gets harder, and so we roll a stone in front of the tomb. But it's not over until God says it is. And in this situation, He hadn't yet said it was over. Then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. And Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." This is the climax of the story. He raises Lazarus from the grave. There are 3 times in the Gospels that we know of, at least, that Jesus raises somebody from the dead. The widow of Nain's son, whom he walks up to as they're having the funeral. He walks up to the funeral bier, touches it. And when he does, that boy rises. And in spite of the fact that he was unclean, Jesus steps into the situation. And did you notice nobody afterwards said, "No, Jesus, he was unclean while he was dead"? Nobody said that to him. Because they knew if he can raise somebody from the grave, he can also make the unclean clean, right? Like, you're not going to question that side of it if you've obviously seen the death to life thing. And then there's Jairus' daughter. And for her, he walks in, sits next to her on the bed, reaches down, grabs her hand, and says, "Talitha cum." There are only a few places in the Bible where it preserves the original Aramaic that Jesus spoke in. This is one of them, and it seems to be because of the fact that Talitha is like a phrase or a word that is about, it's to show the closeness of it. Sweetheart, get up. So he speaks to this dead girl and says, "Oh, sweetheart, it's time to wake up." In the exact same way that I do with my daughter when it's time for her to get up. I sit next to her on the bed and I say, "Sweetheart, it's time to wake up." And she does. And Jesus here speaks to this tomb, and the word that's used here is shouted. It's only used a few times in the Gospels, and it's when the crowds are shouting at him. It's a raw voice. This is a shout of authority. "Lazarus, come forth." And every single time, Jesus commands a dead person to do something. Isn't that brilliant? Because they have no power to do it on their own. And yet he still commands it. And this isn't like a cute little just side note. Jesus commands the impossible to Lazarus. And Lazarus has no power on his own to make it happen. But when Jesus commands something, along with that command comes the power to make it happen. And so Lazarus is able to do what Jesus tells him he should do. Come forth. He has the power to do it. It is totally supernatural, which means that nobody can take credit for this moment but Jesus. We don't look at Lazarus and say, "Good job, Lazarus. You nailed it, man. Like you knocked it out of the park coming forth." No, we look at Jesus and we say, "How? There's only one way. He is God." Nobody else can take credit for it. And when Jesus speaks in that way, now I understand if he wouldn't have waited a few days, he could have spared Mary and Martha and their friends. But there is a greater good here of a real, deep, undeniable belief in him that he wants to give them. And to that end, his love brings them to the place where Lazarus is good and truly and totally dead. And now when the work happens, there's only one possible person who can get every bit of the credit: Jesus. And if you don't think that he still does that today, then you don't understand how God works. Because we are so good at asking him to do the impossible and then taking credit for it afterwards. Like, well, because I'm righteous. Or, because I asked enough times. No, this is all about his power and what he does. And sometimes, very specifically, he will do the same thing again, where he will wait and wait and wait until it is completely out of our power to be able to dig ourselves out of a situation. And then he shows up and we go, "Okay, so then you get all the credit for that, God." Because that's the most loving thing for him to do. Because over and over and over again, we will fall into the same trap of believing that we're the ones who dug ourselves out of the hole when he's the one who lifted us out. And so here he commands Lazarus, come forward when nobody else could make it happen but Jesus. And in the same way, man, there are times in our lives where it seems like the thing is dead. And he says, just believe. And even when you believe, you won't be able to take credit for it because you believed hard enough. That is such a stupid misconception of the faith, that if I believe hard enough, then he'll answer. That takes credit away from God. And that is so wrong, and it is so corrupt, and it removes his power and gives it to me. That's not right. What is right is he is supernatural, he does the work, and I just believe that he will. And that's what he says here. He says, man, I'm not going to give my credit to anybody else. I'm going to take it for myself. And so you just believe as a response. And for us, I mean, look at how the story starts. Jesus is coming up on the end, right? He's just a few miles from Jerusalem. Just a few days before they had tried to kill him. And his disciples say to him, wait a second, Jesus. Don't you remember a couple of days ago? And you want to go back there? And he says, no, come on. He said, there's a certain amount of hours in the day, and I know how long I've got. I know my expiration date. I know when it's going to happen. Multiple times throughout the book of John, he says all along, when my hour comes. 6 times throughout John, it refers to his hour. And until that day, when that hour comes, Jesus knows there is nothing the enemy can do to him. Now, let me say the same to you. Because for some of us, we think this is just the way it is. No. You think that this is what you're going to deal with for the rest of your life. No. And if you think that maybe this is just from now on, the pattern that you will have to follow is one of fear and paralysis. No. And until that day, when he says it is over, it is not over. And when he says it is done, it is done. And until that time, the enemy cannot take you out. So, if you are still breathing, it is not far too late. Because if you are still breathing, then he is still covering and protecting and redeeming and restoring. And if you haven't seen it yet, that's okay. Don't stop believing. Don't stop believing that he will. Don't stop believing that he can. Don't stop believing that he will restore and redeem. And believe me, sometimes, I get it, like sometimes as time passes, it's easy to give up along the way. What I'm saying to you is don't. Because it may just be that when you get to that place where you go, okay, I can't do anything with this, but I need something done, that he will show up and you will say, and you get all the credit. And isn't that the story of our salvation anyways? Because if we don't come to the same place as Lazarus, then we cannot receive new life. Until we realize that I am dead in my sins, I am dead in my transgressions, I cannot dig myself out. And there is a danger of that, right, in the church, because we see I live differently than somebody else because I was raised a certain way. And so it's easy somewhere along the line to start thinking, okay, so if I live this way, then this is what happens. No, it is all a result of his grace and what he has done and the fact that he called the dead alive. That is salvation for us. And so if we get a corrupted view there, it affects every aspect of our faith, and we corrupt every area of our faith because we think it's all about us and what we're accomplishing. And Jesus says, not until you come to the point when you realize you were dead and I called you alive. And Jesus says here, until that day, until that hour, the enemy can't touch me, so I'm not afraid. And for you, until that day when he calls you home, if you are still breathing, there is still redemption and restoration. So that fear and that paralysis, that idea that this is just the way it is, let it go and trust him that it's not over until he says it's over. And when he says it's done, It's done. Let me give you a verse to tell you exactly what I'm talking about here. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. Listen to this. All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. It is by his great mercy that we have been born again, because God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. Now we live with great expectation. Do you live with great expectation? Great expectation. Now we live with great expectation, and we have a priceless inheritance, an inheritance that is kept in heaven for you, pure and undefiled, beyond the reach of change and decay. And through your faith, God is protecting you by his power until you receive this salvation, which is ready to be revealed on the last day for all to see. Did you hear that? What he said was this: he's not done with you yet. And until the day when you draw your last breath and you experience that salvation in its fullest, until that day, he is protecting you. So live with great expectation. If you are living with gloom and doom every day, that is not Christianity. That's republicanism, whatever that is. I'm just saying, there is a better way to live. You don't have to be afraid, because you know what's going to happen. You know what he's doing. And so don't settle for something less than that. Live with great expectation. Let go of the gloom and the doom and the fear and the paralysis, because you know he is protecting you until that day. So don't settle for anything less. And on that day, when you do experience his salvation, when you do go to be in his presence, then you will realize that that inheritance was so much better than you ever could have believed. If something happens to me, don't pray me back. Don't pray me back. Because if I'm in heaven and God says to me, Alan, I know it's been 4 days, but they're praying you back. You've got to leave heaven and go back to misery. Truly, there is such an inheritance for us. But until that day, until you breathe your last and you are in his presence, man, don't live with gloom and doom. Live with great expectation. And even if you think, man, it's far too late, too much time has passed, he's not done yet. And sometimes that time specifically is allowed so that you will give him all the glory and honor and praise when he shows up. And there's nobody else who can take credit for it. So trust him in that. Trust him in that. Don't fall for all the traps of this world, which will spin you up, spin you around, get you all freaked out when he is doing something that is so much bigger, so much far-reaching. His ways are not our ways, right? We can't draw a straight line between how we would handle something and how he handles something, because those aren't the same thing. He knows things we don't know. He loves in ways that we do not love. And he has designs that are much greater than anything we can imagine. And so he's at work. And as he's at work, we let go, we trust him, we believe, and we live with the great expectation.